Good morning, lovelies. Today we are going to be talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Before we get started, remember to click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss another video. I post new videos on Sunday. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. All the links are in the description. The birthday giveaway is still going on. 5 subscribers will receive a signed copy of Homestead Hunts, my illustrated sci-fi novella. Subscribe to the channel for a chance to win. This video is going to be different from the others on this channel. Rather than reviewing the book, I'm going to summarize the whole thing, cover to cover. In other words, there will be spoilers. I'd apologize, but this was published in 1818. You've had time. Before we talk about Frankenstein, we need to talk about its author, Mary Shelley. Shelley wrote this on a dare when she was 18 years old. She and her husband, she married when she was 16 years old, Victorian England. So she and her husband were visiting some other writer friends in the country, but the weather was so bad that they had to stay in the cabin, and they ended up telling ghost stories, because what else are you gonna do? One of the other writers said, hey, each of us should write a ghost story, and the others agreed. Shelley was the only one who followed through, and she got the idea of her story literally from a bad dream she had. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful it must be, for supremely frightful would be the effect on any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, that this thing which had received such imperfect animation would subside into dead matter, and he might sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench forever the transient existence of the hideous corpse which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. Thus was the start of one of the first modern science fiction and horror books in Western literature. It made such an impact that it got turned into one of the first movies in Hollywood, although the scriptwriters veered quite a ways from the original story. Let's get started. The framing sequence for Frankenstein is that it's being narrated by Victor and written down by Robert Walton, who's captained a ship going to the North Pole. Robert has set out on a scientific expedition, hoping to discover what's really so far up north behind all that ice and snow. Nobody tell him that it's really just more ice and snow. This is obviously a very dangerous journey, especially in the early 19th century, but Robert is convinced that he's going to find something amazing up there. But he runs into problems when his ship gets stuck in the ice. That's when things get weird. He and his crew spot a large man, at least 8 feet tall, riding a dog sled even further north. The man's too far away for them to talk to, so they just watch him go. The next day, the ice lets them go, and they find another man in another dog sled, this one normal-sized and half dead. They bring him aboard, and surprise, surprise, this is Viktor Frankenstein. While Victor is recovering from running around the pole for several months, he tells Robert how he got to where he is. Basically, he decides to give Robert his entire life story. It's practically an autobiography, but it boils down to happy childhood, rich parents, mom died of illness, he's got a best friend named Henry Clerval, he's got a couple of brothers, and one adopted sister named Elizabeth who he really wants to marry. Ew. Now, Victor's always been a science geek, specifically natural science. He wants to know how everything works, the nature of nature, and this curiosity becomes an obsession when he gets sent to college. He's there for 3 years, absorbing as much as he can about natural science, chemistry, and mathematics, and then he decides that he's going to create life. And not the fun way that most college students create life. He's going to raid a crap ton of graveyards, stitch all the best pieces together, and reanimate the result. Which, by the way, he never tells us how he does this. Given his equipment and studies, it probably involves some sort of alchemy, but that's all we know. Normally, when a scientist, especially a student scientist, decides to test out a radical new theory, they start with a small, heavily documented experiment. Animals first, like mice, and then working your way up to monkeys, then humans, all while keeping clear public notes so that other scientists can replicate the experiment and make sure nothing disastrous happens. Viktor doesn't do any of this. He jumps straight into the human trials, which anyone with half a brain cell will tell you is a bad idea. This process takes almost a year, in which Viktor throws himself completely into his work to the neglect of everything else, including his own health. Shelley really nailed the college student aspect of Viktor's life. Now, while almost everyone knows about the theme of science gone wrong in this book, there's another theme here: parenting gone wrong. There's a lot of little details that make this whole process look like Viktor is making his son rather than just a science experiment. For one, the process takes about 9 months, during which time Viktor deals with some of the same symptoms that many pregnant people deal with. He has anxiety, he gets feverish, and he looks forward to exercise and amusement once his creation is complete. Any pregnant person will tell you that they are really looking forward to when they're not pregnant anymore. And when the monster is created, some of his early physical descriptions are similar to that of a newborn. It's important to remember that even though Shelley was 18 when she wrote this, she was married and had given birth to 2 kids, one of which died without a name, like the monster, a week later. And it's stated in the book more than once how Viktor failed as a parent figure, and we see how he failed almost immediately. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning, the rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years, for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room. So, yeah, he ditches his creation immediately after creating it and goes to take a nap. He has a couple of nightmares, and then this happens. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead, my teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed, when, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. Viktor spends the night avoiding his dorm, and in the morning runs into his friend Henry Clerval, who tells Viktor that he and the family haven't really heard from him in the last 3 years, and he's here to make sure Viktor is still alive. Viktor and Clerval go to Viktor's dorm, but instead of finding a reanimated corpse, they find that the place is entirely empty. Viktor decides that the problem must have solved itself, and then passes out. He gets sick and feverish for several months, during which time Clerval nurses him back to health, and they send letters back home saying that everything's fine and Viktor's planning to quit college because he's totally done with science anyway. Yet another thing the movies got wrong. Frankenstein isn't a doctor. He's a college dropout. Then the boys get a letter from home saying that Viktor's kid brother William was murdered. Elizabeth is tearing herself up over it because she gave William permission to wear an expensive locket, which is now missing. It gets worse when the locket turns up in the pocket of the housekeeper, Justine, who's also a dear friend of Elizabeth and Victor. Victor and Clairvaux rush back home, and then Victor takes a moment to angst in a thunderstorm. I'd make an emo joke, but the guy just lost his brother, so I'm letting it slide. While I watched The Tempest, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure, which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object, and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy Damon, to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. So, yeah, the monster that Victor created murdered a child and framed an innocent woman. Obviously, Victor tells the nearest authorities, or at least his family, who it is that did the deed, where the monster was last seen, and provide evidence like his notes or a small-scale experiment with an animal to prove his claims and then bring justice to the victim. I'm just kidding, he doesn't say a word. My first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer and cause instant pursuit to be made, but I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being with whom I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever with which I had been seized just at the time that I dated my creation, and which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a relation to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relatives to commence it. And then of what use would be pursuit? Who could arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mont Saleve? These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. Victor stays silent all throughout the trial, false confession, death sentence, and execution of Justine. That's how you know he's the good guy. After Justine's execution, the family is in mourning, both for her and William. Victor decides to go to the mountains to hike his feelings away, and then runs into none other than the monster, who he immediately declares he will kill. Here's another thing that the movies got wrong. The monster is intelligent. This is his response. "I expected this reception," said the Damon. "All men hate the wretched. How, then, must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my Creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them, and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." He cools off a bit, and then says, "Be calm, I entreat you to hear me, before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, to the which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good, misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." You know, it's interesting how the way he talks versus how everyone else talks, because the monster learned how to talk and read from older sources, and he kind of maintains this a little bit throughout the book. His speech patterns become more and more similar to Frankenstein and everyone around him as the story progresses, but he's still the one who drops the most these and thous than anyone else in the story, and that's because of where he learned it from. So now we get a look at what the monster's been doing for the last several months. After Viktor ran out of the dorm, the monster wandered around, not really understanding his surroundings. He's basically a giant newborn baby at this point. And while Shelley was trying to go for a more biblical theme with how he gradually discovers the world around him, it's also very similar to the stages of infant and child development. The monster goes into the woods surviving off of nuts and berries. He discovers light, animals, and fire, and like Viktor, seeks to understand more of the world around him as he observes his surroundings and experiments with them. Eventually, he leaves the woods for more food and runs into civilization. The first person he meets, an old man in a hut, runs away from him screaming, which the monster finds curious but doesn't really think much of it. It's not until he gets to a town and is violently chased out that he decides he really should avoid humans. He ends up sheltering in a shed against the cottage of the DeLacy family, which he can watch and listen to through a crack in their wall. Creepy, but still basically a child at this point. The DeLacy's patriarch is an old man who has 2 adult children, Felix and Agatha. Eventually, Felix's long-lost love, an Arabian named Saifi, shows up, and because she doesn't speak the local language, Felix teaches her, and inadvertently also teaches the monster. From these lessons, the monster also learns about history, philosophy, and how law and the justice system works. These wonderful narrations inspired me with the strange feelings. Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? He appeared at one time a mere scion of the evil in principle, and at another as all that can be conceived of noble and godlike. To be a great and virtuous man appeared the highest honor that can befall a sensitive being. To be base and vicious, as many on record have been, appeared the lowest degradation, a condition more abject than that of the blind mole or harmless worm. For a long time I could not conceive how one man could go forth to murder his fellow, or even why there were laws and governments. But when I heard details of vice and bloodshed, my wonder ceased, and I turned away with disgust and loathing. This original attitude of the monster is why a lot of people who read this book don't really blame him for everything that's transpired, arguing that he was driven to murder by his creator and humanity. Moving on, the monster also learns how to read, picking up a few thematically appropriate books like Paradise Lost. Since he grabbed Viktor's dressing gown when he left the dorm, he also has access to some of Viktor's papers, including the notes of how he was created, who Viktor Frankenstein is, and where he lives. And because of the monster's circumstances, he begins to hate Viktor, blaming him for not only creating him, but placing him in a world where nobody accepts him, forcing him to live a life of solitude and loneliness. The more I saw of them, the DeLacy family, the greater became my desire to claim their protection and kindness. My heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures. To see their sweet looks directed towards me with affection was the utmost limit of my ambition. I dared not think that they would turn them from me with disdain and horror. The poor that stopped at their door were never driven away. I asked, it is true, for greater treasures than a little food or rest. I required kindness and sympathy, but I did not believe myself utterly unworthy of it. That in mind, the monster decides to try an experiment. The old man of the cottage is blind, so when the others leave for their daily errands, the monster knocks on the door, pretending to be a traveler. He and the old man talk, and it goes all right until the others come back. At that moment, I heard the steps of my younger protectors. I had not a moment to lose, but seizing the hand of the old man, I cried, "Now is the time. Save and protect me. You and your family are the friends whom I seek. Do not you desert me in the hour of trial." "Great God!" exclaimed the old man. "Who are you?" At that instant, the cottage door was opened, and Felix, Saifi, and Agatha entered. Who can describe their horror and consternation on beholding me? Agatha fainted, and Saifi, unable to attend to her friend, rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted forward, and with supernatural force tore me from his father, to whose knees I clung, in a transport of fury. He dashed me to the ground and struck me violently with a stick. I could have torn him limb from limb, as the lion rends the antelope, but my heart sunk within me as with bitter sickness, and I refrained. I saw him on the point of repeating his blow, when, overcome by pain and anguish, I quitted the cottage, and in the general tumult escaped unperceived to my hovel. So that didn't go well. The de Lacys move out immediately, afraid that the monster will return, and he burns their house down in retribution. There was none among the myriads of men that existed who would pity or assist me, and should I feel kindness toward my enemies? No. From that moment I declared everlasting war against the species, and, more than all, against him who had formed me, and sent me forth to this insupportable misery. So now the monster's decided to go after Victor, and runs into his brother William, who makes the mistake of dropping his last name, at which point the monster immediately strangles him. I gazed on my victim, and my heart swelled with exultation and hellish triumph. Clapping my hands, I exclaimed, "I too can create desolation. My enemy is not invulnerable. This death will carry despair to him, and 1,000 other miseries shall torment and destroy him." Because the monster knows a bit about how law enforcement works, he makes sure to steal the locket and place it in the pocket of a random woman, who happens to be Justine. This not only makes sure no one will hunt down the real killer, it also provides yet another way for the monster to lash out at the world that has, so far, shown him nothing but cruelty and pain. But the monster didn't track Victor across the mountains just to chat. He has a request. I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me. But one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species, and have the same defects. This being you must create. Victor, at first, refuses to make this guy a girlfriend, but the monster argues with him. I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? You, my creator, would tear me to pieces, and triumph. Remember that, and tell me why I should pity man more than he pities me. You would not call it murder if you could precipitate me into one of those ice rifts and destroy my frame, the work of your own hands. Shall I respect man when he condemns me? Let him live with me in the interchange of kindness, and instead of injury, I would bestow every benefit upon him with tears of gratitude at his acceptance. But that cannot be. The human senses are insurmountable barriers to our union, yet mine shall not be the submission of abject slavery. I will revenge my injuries. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, and chiefly towards you, my arch enemy, because my creator do I swear inextinguishable hatred. Have a care. I will work at your destruction, nor finish until I desolate your heart, so that you shall curse the hour of your birth. Basically, the monster's saying that he's only doing these horrible things because he's lonely. Give him a bride and he won't be lonely or murder anyone else. Also, if Victor doesn't, he'll murder everyone he cares about. Thoroughly sold, Victor agrees. Victor returns home to prepare and is asked by his father to finally marry Elizabeth, since their family could really use a win right now. Victor agrees, but says he's got to run to England real quick and just do this one thing. Clerval goes with him, and they split up. Clerval to have fun, and Victor to go up to Scotland and do science. He's almost done creating the bride when something occurs to him. As I sat, a train of reflection occurred to me, which led me to consider the effects of what I was now doing. Now he thinks about consequences. 3 years before, I was engaged in the same manner, and had created a fiend whose unparalleled barbarity had desolated my heart, and filled it forever with the bitterest remorse. I was now about to form another being, of whose dispositions I was alike ignorant. She might become 10,000 times more malignant than her mate, and delight, for its own sake, in murder and wretchedness. He had sworn to quit the neighborhood of man and hide himself in deserts, but she had not, and she, who in all probability was to become a thinking and reasoning animal, might refuse to comply with a compact made before her creation. They might even hate each other. The creature who already lived loathed his own deformity, and might he not conceive a greater abhorrence for it when it came before his eyes in the female form? She also might turn with disgust from him to the superior beauty of man. She might quit him, and he be again alone, exasperated by the fresh provocation of being deserted by one of his own species. Even if they were to leave Europe and inhabit the deserts of the New World, yet one of the first results of those sympathies for which the daemon thirsted would be children, and a race of devils would be propagated upon the earth who might make the very existence of the species of man a condition precarious and full of terror. Had I right for my own benefit to inflict this curse upon everlasting generations? I had before been moved by the sophisms of the being I had created. I had been struck senseless by his fiendish threats. But now, for the first time, the wickedness of my promise burst upon me. I shudder to think that future ages might curse me as their pest, whose selfishness had not hesitated to buy its own peace at the price, perhaps, of the existence of the whole human race. Just to be clear here, Victor's not hesitating because this might cause problems for other people. He's hesitating because those people would blame him for those problems. He destroys his work, and the monster is pissed. He tries threatening Victor again, but when that doesn't work, he promises that he'll be with Victor on his wedding night. Rather than draw the logical conclusion as to what that threat really means, Victor assumes that the monster will be gunning for him, and this train of thought doesn't change even after Clerval winds up dead the next day. The locals arrest Victor as the prime suspect, but that's kind of awkward because he immediately falls sick. When he comes around, his dad's already bailed him out of jail, he's declared not guilty, and goes back home. He agrees to marry Elizabeth in 10 days, thinking that since the monster is clearly going to murder him and no one else, he can lure the monster into a trap and kill him. This goes about as well as you would expect. I reflected how fearful the combat which I momentarily expected would be to my wife, and I earnestly entreated her to retire, resolving not to join her until I had obtained some knowledge as to the situation of my enemy. She left me, and I continued some time walking up and down the passages of the house, and inspecting every corner that might afford a retreat to my adversary. But I discovered no trace of him, and was beginning to conjecture that some fortunate chance had intervened to prevent the execution of his menaces, when suddenly I heard a shrill and dreadful scream. It came from the room into which Elizabeth had retired. As I heard it, the whole truth rushed into my mind. My arms dropped, the motion of every muscle and fiber was suspended. I could feel the blood trickling in my veins and tingling in the extremities of my limbs. This state lasted but for an instant. The scream was repeated, and I rushed into the room. Great God, why did I not then expire? Why am I here to relate the destruction of the best hope and the purest creature of earth? She was there, lifeless and inanimate, thrown across the bed, her head hanging down, and her pale and distorted features half covered by her hair. Everywhere I turn I see the same figure, her bloodless arms and relaxed form flung by the murderer on its bridal bier. Could I behold this and live? Alas, life is obstinate and clings closest where it is most hated. For a moment only did I lose recollection. I fell senseless on the ground. To add insult to injury, Victor's father is so heartbroken that he dies a few days later. At this point, finally, Victor tells the authorities everything that's happened and who they need to arrest. But the magistrate doesn't believe him, so Victor decides that he's going to get revenge himself. The monster makes no effort to stop this. In fact, he encourages it, even leaving notes and food behind for Victor to keep him going. This is one part cruelty because the monster's a dick, and one part loneliness. As much as they hate each other and want to hurt one another, Victor is the only companion the monster has. And honestly, it's kind of vice versa at this point. Victor chases the monster all the way up north until the ice cracked and stranded him where Robert's ship picked him up. Right after Victor's done telling his story, Robert's ship gets stuck in some ice again, and the crew thinks that this is really about as much danger as they're willing to put themselves in. They ask that as soon as they're out of the ice, they go back home. Victor calls them all chicken for not sticking it out through their first real danger on this expedition, which means he has learned absolutely nothing from his ordeal. Robert, on the other hand, does end up following the crew's wishes. As soon as they're out of the ice, they go back south. It's interesting to note here that he is disappointed that he's not able to keep pushing forward, but Robert has learned an important lesson. While he's willing to endanger his own life for scientific pursuit, he's not going to endanger other people's lives if they're not on board. And I think that's a pretty good place to draw the line. Then Victor dies because a man who continuously drops into fevered illnesses as often as he does really should not be running around the North Pole. The monster shows up to pay his respects, and he and Robert end up talking. The monster says that, really, the saddest thing about all this is how he feels, and that it's so sad that he was given no choice but to go on a murderous rampage. To which Robert replies, "Bitch, no." There are 3 schools of thought when it comes to who exactly is to blame for everything that's happened in this book. Viktor Frankenstein for creating and then abandoning a human being, humanity for being a dick to someone just because they look weird, or the monster for causing the death of 5 people. Robert is firmly in the blame the monster camp, because you don't get to kill 5 people, one of them being a child, and then say how sad you are that those people died. I personally think it's everyone's fault, but I'd shift most of the blame on Frankenstein. He had multiple opportunities to nip this in the bud, and he didn't. Anyway, the monster interrupts Robert to monologue a little bit, and then he says this: "Fear not that I shall be the instrument of future mischief. My work is nearly complete. Neither yours nor any man's death is needed to consummate the series of my being, and accomplish that which must be done, but it requires my own. Do not think that I shall be slow to perform this sacrifice. I shall quit your vessel on the ice raft which brought me thither, and shall seek the most northern extremity of the globe. I shall collect my funeral pile, and consume to ashes this miserable frame, that its remains may afford no light to any curious and unhallowed wretch who would create such another as I have been. I shall die. I shall no longer feel the agonies which now consume me, or be the prey of feelings unsatisfied, yet unquenched. He is dead who called me into being, and when I shall be no more, the very remembrance of us both will speedily vanish. I shall no longer see the sun or stars, or feel the winds play on my cheeks. Light, feeling, and sense will pass away, and in this condition must I find my happiness. Some years ago, when the images which this world affords first opened upon me, when I felt the cheering warmth of summer, and heard the rustling of the leaves and the warbling of the birds, and these were all to me, I should have wept to die. Now it is my only consolation. Polluted by crimes and torn by the bitterest remorse, where can I find rest but in death?" At which point he jumps off the ship to do just that. So yeah, that's Frankenstein. I've told you my thoughts, and now I really want to hear yours in the comments. Is the monster to blame for everything it did? Or is it Victor's fault? Or humanity's fault? Or someone else's fault? My birthday giveaway is still going on, so hit subscribe for a chance to win a signed copy of Homestead Hunts. If you want early access to these videos and more content, my Patreon and social media links are in the description. And more importantly, don't reanimate the dead. If you do, stick around so it doesn't turn into an asshole. Bye, lovelies!